Welcome to episode 49 of the Tax Professionals podcast. In this episode, I share with you 5 skills to master early in your tax career so you have the fundamentals for a solid career.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
I stand up from my desk and walk to a meeting room where I'm about to have a one-on-one with the partner of my team, Sam. I sit down with her and we start talking. One of the main reasons I decided to work in tax was because I wanted the intellectual challenge. I enjoyed that side of university and so I knew I wanted that to be a part of my work. And so I enrolled into my first ATT exam as soon as I could. From the start of my career to date, I've taken every opportunity to do work of a technical nature. I was the weird one that actually used College Yellow books almost daily. I had no idea what case law was, but I got stuck in when I got asked to do case law research for the first time. I was going to be this all-great tax advisor once I'd mastered my technical ability. So I'm in this meeting room having this one-on-one and Sam draws some boxes on a piece of paper. In one box she puts technical, in another she puts advisory, and in another she puts sales. She points to each of the boxes and talks through each of them. She explains to me that, in her view, these are the key facets of being a great tax advisor. Up until this point, my sole focus had been the technical element. I won't become this all-great tax advisor unless I develop my other skills too. After this meeting, I walk back to my desk with a much better appreciation of what it takes to be a great tax advisor, and I know now where I need to develop. I still remember this conversation vividly today, as it was a real kickstarter for me to realise that technical skills would actually only get me so far in my career. I've had a bunch of Teams meetings recently with numerous people where they have shared with me what they think are the key skills to master early in your tax career. And in this episode, I wanted to share these with you to help you to prepare yourself for the rest of your career. The ones I have chosen are my opinion on the matter based on these discussions and also based on my experiences, and you may or other people may have different opinions to this. I remember when I wanted to start developing my non-technical skills, I tried to find training that would be relevant for me as a tax advisor, but I quickly realised that nothing bespoke and tailored seemed to exist. There's plenty out there for more senior people, but nothing for people early on in their career outside of technical training, that is, like doing the qualifications, ATT, CTA, etc. I think this is a real shame really, and it's part of the reason that I decided to start this podcast. I've been thinking for a while now for how I can further help tax professionals to develop and progress, so I've started designing some bespoke courses to help tax professionals early in their careers quickly develop the key skills for working in tax. And by early in their career, I'm meaning those who are completely new to tax all the way up to manager-ish level, so about 0 to 5 years experience. At least that's where I'm going to start off anyway. There's so much potential waiting to be unlocked, and I believe that with the right training, new tax professionals can become super valuable to clients, their employers and to themselves much earlier in their career, maybe than has traditionally been the case by just learning on the job. I've not finalised the details of the courses yet, but I aim to be doing a mix of online and face-to-face courses and do more than just provide you with information like most training courses do. I want people to take away real value and practical skills that they can apply immediately from the courses. If you'd like to be one of the first people I share more details with, once I finalise them, head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/training for tax professionals, where you can register your interest and leave me with your contact details so that I can let you know more information once it's available. You'll be able to remove your interest at any time. And if you'd like to get in touch with me at any point in relation to any of this or anything else for that matter, you can send an email to me at jack@thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com. That's jack@thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com. No need to remember these links as they will all appear in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP49. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP49. And TTPP49 just stands for the Tax Professionals Podcast, episode 49. When I graduated, my first job choice was to be an actuary, with working in tax as a close second. And even though I've enjoyed all my tax roles, it wasn't until I became CTA qualified that I decided tax was where I wanted to stay. With tax, there's so many different roles and places to work. They all provide something a bit different. And while that's great, it's meant I've spent a lot of time thinking about what areas of tax I want to work in and where I want to take my career long term. I've been caught up in my own thoughts. I've had doubts. I've been unsure. What's been most useful for me is talking to others, saying what I'm thinking, having someone listen, and hearing their advice. The tax recruitment company understands this and can help you with a free career coaching chat with them. They have over 60 years experience in the sector. They can help you explore the options, they can help you decide what's best for you, and they can help you to create a plan to transform your tax career, making you feel more content and happier in your life. You can book a free, no obligation call with them by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/free career chat. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/free career chat. Thanks to the Tax Recruitment Company for sponsoring the podcast, which is helping me to continue creating episodes. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. The first skill that I think is important to master early on in your tax career is being able to undertake tax research. So what do I mean by tax research? Tax research is where you go away to find the answer to specific tax questions, and more wider than that, just researching tax topics so that you can understand the rules for different elements of your role. I was actually contacted by a CIOT committee recently to do a talk on this because it's actually one of my most passionate subjects and I just really enjoy talking about it. I think actually it was one of the first episodes I actually did for the podcast, and I've come back to it recently because I just quite enjoyed talking about the topic and helping people with it. I think I was fortunate that early on in my career I had a lot of time to do research, and because it was something I enjoyed as well, it just meant that I suppose I could figure out ways that seemed to work for me, and whenever I've shared these with people it seems to have helped them as well. There's so many different elements to undertaking tax research well, I think. For example, where do you go to look for the answer or for the rules that you need to learn about? There's lots of different places and lots of different credible resources. So do you start with the legislation? Do you start with HMRC's guidance? Do you start with case law? Do you start with a random Google search? Lots of different things, and I think dependent on the scenario, you will probably start in different places. So for example, if you have absolutely no idea where to start at all, then Google's probably the good place to start and get a bit of an idea first, then you can do a more accurate and credible search later on. Whereas if, say, you know quite a lot about the area that you already want to do research on, and let's say you know where it is in the legislation and you can go straight to it, that might be the better place to start. So it's going to depend on the situation. I think equally when it comes to doing tax research, it's important to be able to write up your research so that someone else can check your research, they can review it and make sure that you've come to the right answer. I think that is probably equally as important, if not more important, than being able to actually do the research, because obviously when you're a less experienced member of staff, you're more likely to make errors, and in any event, every firm I've ever worked for has a 4i review process, so it's going to need to be reviewed, and the better that you can write that up and the better way you can do that, the more easy it will be for your colleagues. I suppose the last element to it really that kind of springs to my mind is when it comes to doing tax research, you're very rarely going to come across something that gives you the exact answer to the question that you have. What's more likely going to be the case is that you're going to come across the relevant rules. You're then going to have to interpret them and apply them to the facts that you have in a particular case. So the skill, I suppose, really is being able to read, analyse and interpret things, whether it's legislation or guidance or something else, and then being able to apply it to the facts. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of different elements and areas to being able to undertake tax research well and have that as a strong skill. And if you can become better in each of those areas, it's going to make you quicker at doing the research. It's going to make you more effective and efficient. It's going to de-risk for your employers, and it's probably going to allow you to add more value to your clients as well, because you can then not only think about the situation that you've been asked about, you can also think about ways that you can put the client in a potentially better position. The second skill that I think is important to master early on in your tax career is being able to explain tax concepts clearly to others and tailoring this to who you're speaking to. So if you're speaking to a fellow colleague, then you'll probably be speaking about it in a much more technical way with more jargon and tax talk. Whereas if you're talking to a client and let's say they work in HR, they're not going to understand all the tax words that you use, and you're going to need to explain that and talk about it in a completely different way. The reason I think this is such an important skill to have is because if you can't explain what's in your head and people can't understand you because of that, then you just can't add any value to people. So you might be the best person in the world at finding the answer to a tax question, but if you can't explain the answer to other people, then the point of being able to find the answer is almost lost in a way. It might sound a bit ridiculous and a bit extreme, but hopefully you get the gist. So when it comes to explaining tax concepts, there's two ways to do it really. There's obviously writing. If you're writing it, that's one way of explaining stuff, and also verbally. And I think these are very different skills to each other, because when you put something in writing, you have a lot of time, I suppose, to think about it. People have time to also read what you've written and reread it and think about it. Whereas when you're speaking verbally, once you've said it and the person's had a few seconds to take it in, that's it. So they are very different skills, but saying that, I think actually working on one of them helps you with the other. Particularly for me, I found writing stuff first would help me to then explain something verbally much better later on. I've actually got a full separate episode on ways that you can explain things clearly, and I don't want to kind of go over them again here because there's no point in that. So I'll give a link to that episode in the show notes for this episode. The show notes can be accessed at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP49. But saying that, I will leave you with this one story that kind of stuck with me, I suppose, from right early on in my career. So there was one person I used to work with that used to, basically every time he was explaining something, he would draw it in some way. And usually the diagrams would be really useful. So, for example, when there was like a massive supply chain, he would draw like a box for each company in the supply chain and then arrows between them, and then use that to kind of help him explain it and to help me to understand it. And this one time I remember he was explaining a bit about the pay-as-you-earn system to me, and he drew a diagram with like money falling through the air and a hand going in and grabbing that money, and he was basically using that to say that the pay-as-you-earn system is essentially HMRC sticking their hand in, grabbing money from an employee and taking it before it reaches the employee. And whilst I suppose the pay-as-you-earn system and explaining how that works is relatively simple compared to a lot of other tax concepts, the diagram just made it a bit more enjoyable, a bit more fun. And in the cases where he was explaining something more difficult and more complicated, the diagrams always helped to understand it. So that's something to bear in mind, is that when you're explaining things, you don't always have to just use words. You can use other things as well, such as diagrams or flowcharts or whatever it is. You're not just limited to words. The third skill that I think it's important to master early on in your tax career is your tax advisory skills. Now, you might be thinking that this is similar to being able to explain the tax rules, but it's one thing being able to explain a tax concept, and then it's another thing to be able to turn that into advice that's valuable, that's practical, and that's commercial for your client. About a month ago, I had a client call me up. They were about to pay some bonuses to staff, and some staff wanted to have their bonuses paid into their pension scheme. And the client had recently changed their tax relief method on the pension scheme, and it was causing them a bit of confusion. So they had a few questions around that they wanted to ask me, just to make sure that they were doing things right. And I talked to them about it and told them that what they're doing is right, it is compliant, but at the same time, I knew there was a way that they could structure these payments into the pension scheme so that it would save national insurance for both the employer and the employee. And so I told them about that at the time and helped them to set it up in a way that was the most efficient for tax and national insurance. The reason I'm telling you this is because I could have just gave the client the answer to their specific questions and they would have found that useful. But what's more useful is giving them the advice to let them know that they could structure this actually in a better way and then helping them to actually do it. So I think that's the difference between just explaining a tax concept and also then providing advice on top of it. And I know for me, very early on in my tax career, I wouldn't have been thinking, like, what's the way that I can structure this to make it better? I would have just been thinking, right, this is the question, this is the answer, here you go, and I would have left it at that. But that's a missed opportunity because I wouldn't be really providing advice at that point, or at least not as good advice as what I could have provided. So in a case like this, you do actually need technical knowledge on the subject to kind of know of what the possibilities are. But just knowing the technical knowledge itself doesn't mean that you're then going to provide that extra piece of advice to a client. So if you work on your advisory scores, then it's obviously going to improve in that regard. And that situation seems like an easy one because whatever happens, if you just answer the specific questions or whether you go further to help them structure it in a better way, you're still providing them with valuable information. But there's some situations where you can only add great value really if you are providing practical and commercial advice based on the situation. And an example of where this is the case in the area of tax that I work in, employment taxes, is in relation to IR35. When you're doing a determination to figure out whether someone is within or is not within IR35, you use the employment status tests, and the employment status tests are a very grey area, I think it's fair to say. So one person could have one view as to what the answer is, and another person could have another view as to what the answer is. So it's a very imperfect scenario. So in this case, your advice needs to be something that is practical for your client, something that leaves them in a good position and I suppose mitigates their risks well, without it being perfect. Once you've developed strong advisory skills, you'll be able to use them to help them create this process that's not perfect but significantly reduces their risk and is likely to leave them with the right answer almost every time. So in order to provide advice in these type of cases, I do think you need to have a good awareness of how businesses work and what's commercial and what's practical in terms of the real world, I suppose. So as a tax advisor, sometimes we can almost sit in our ivory tower and think that the tax rules are like king, I suppose, and they rule every decision in a business, but that's just not the case. And what's commercial for one client of yours might be very different to what's commercial and practical for another client of yours. So once you've kind of acquired good advisory skills, you'll be able to tailor your advice to the different clients and come up with a process or something that works for both of those clients that's similar but also different and bespoke at the same time. So hopefully you can see how having good tax advisory skills is an important skill to have and to build early on in your tax career because this is where you can really help your clients. Just a reminder that you can book a free career coaching chat with the Tax Recruitment Company by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/free career chat. The Tax Recruitment Company can help you decide what's best for you and your career. So the fourth skill that I think is important for you to master early on in your tax career is what I'm going to call inspection or fact establishing skills. So let's say you're going to do a tax review on behalf of a client, and just because I work in employment taxes, let's just say we're doing a review into the employment tax affairs of one of our clients. In order to undertake a review, you need to establish information and the facts that are relevant to the client that you're doing the review on. So one way that you can do this is through having discussions with the client where you will ask them a bunch of different questions and where they will share a lot of information with you. But on top of that, it's inevitable that you're going to be given a bunch of documents that you're going to have to go through, review, inspect, and get the facts from yourself. So when I'm talking about the inspection and fact establishing skills, I'm talking about, I suppose, both of those things, but more so focused on the going through the documents, establishing the facts, so then you can, I suppose, identify the risks and potential opportunities for the clients to save tax. So it's not just tax reviews where this skill's useful. So I remember very early on in my career, probably within the first 12 months, probably between 6 and 12 months, I basically got given a large cardboard box full of employee expense claims. And my job was essentially to go through all of those expense claims and figure out the ones that were good, so the ones where there was basically no or minimal risk because there were, say, receipts for the expense claims, and that all the claims appeared to be in line with the tax rules for them to be tax-free and NI-free. And then also the bad claims, or the ones where there was either something missing or it seems like some part of the claim didn't meet the expense rules. So very quickly, as part of that task, I needed to develop my inspection skills and find all the relevant facts so that I could present them to my colleagues, and then they could use them for what they needed to use them for. In that circumstance for me, I was already fortunate enough to know about the tax rules, so I could inspect the facts and then also apply the tax rules as well. But there's definitely been cases for me, and there will be probably for you as well, where you just need to find the facts before you really know exactly what the rules are. Now, of course, it's going to be helpful to pick out the relevant facts if you understand the relevant rules, but there's also times when you might not necessarily know up front what the relevant rules are. You just need to pick out the relevant information, and obviously it's much more difficult when you don't know exactly what the rules are and what facts are going to be relevant up front, and that itself is a skill. So hopefully you can see how that's going to be important, and you might be thinking that this skill is much more appropriate to some roles than it is to other roles, and I think that's completely fair. So any role where doing due diligence, doing tax due diligence where there's a sale of a business, those roles, there's going to be a lot of inspection and fact establishing. Also, if you're a HMRC inspector that goes out and does inquiries, then this is going to be, I suppose, one of the most important, if not the most important skill, is being able to establish the relevant facts and inspect records, etc. But equally, even roles where you might not think this is obviously an important skill, it still is important. So, for example, if you're someone that does solely tax returns, let's say personal tax returns, then you get given a lot of information and a lot of documents to look through. And so if you can go through and inspect those documents and pick out all the relevant information just for the tax return, great, but you could also inspect from a wider level to maybe think, oh, well, actually, there's some information here that I think means that we can give advice in this area and it's going to save them a bunch of money, or it's going to be better for them. So then either you could advise the client, or maybe a colleague will give some advice to the client. But you can kind of see how this ties into providing advice. So there is some, I suppose, overlap between skills in that one skill can help you be better at the other, which is why I suppose both of these skills have featured on the list, providing advice and the inspection skills, because both of them I think are necessary in order to do each other. So the fifth and final skill that I think is important for you to master early on in your tax career is relationship building and relationship maintaining skills. So this one is, I would say, much less specific to tax, but equally very valuable for people who do work in tax, because relationships really are key, both with internal staff and with external people, for example, clients, because if you can't build relationships with people that you work with internally, then no one's going to want to work with you. And I suppose equally from a client perspective, if you can't build relationships with clients, then they're not going to want to work with you. And that would just be a massively lost opportunity. So relationships are built, I would say, just through interactions with clients. So that could be meetings with them, it could be calls, it could be emails, whatever it is. Relationships are built through the interactions that you have with people. So I suppose really you need to know how to use each of those interactions to be able to build relationships and also to maintain them and not damage them. So this will probably depend also based on the person you're speaking to. So some people will much prefer to be called up or have a meeting, and some people will prefer emails. And so if you've got good relationship building and relationship maintaining skills, then you will be able to pick out the relevant one depending on the person that you're interacting with. If you can't build relationships with people, then in the worst case scenario, people just won't want to work with you. And then it doesn't matter how good all of your other skills are. If people don't want to work with you, then you can't use those other skills to add value and use them in a useful way. I suppose people also are much more likely to listen to you and take on board your advice if they have a good relationship with you and they trust you. It will allow you to be more impactful with your clients and add more value. Whereas if you don't have a good relationship with them, then you just won't be as impactful. And this could just end up being, I suppose, a frustrating scenario for you. This is a term that's, I think, overused, but I think for good reason. Being a trusted advisor and a colleague is something that people find really valuable. And, well, how do you become trusted? You become trusted through building strong relationships with people. So hopefully you can see at this point how having good relationship building skills, both in relation to internal people, clients, whoever it is an important skill to have, because then you can add a real impact through the tax advice and related things that you provide throughout your career. In summary then, for this episode, the 5 skills I think are important for you to master early on in your tax career are tax research skills, being able to explain tax concepts clearly to others and being able to tailor those explanations dependent on who you're speaking to. It's important to have good advisory skills that you can take the knowledge, you can take the tax research that you've done and use it to provide commercial, practical and valuable advice to your clients. It's important to master the skill of being able to inspect records and be able to establish facts early in your tax career, because particularly early on, I think you're more likely to be in a position where you need to use this skill, but it's going to be a skill that's inevitably going to be useful throughout your whole tax career. And the last skill that I think it's useful for you to master early on in your tax career is relationship building skills, whether that's in relation to internal people or external people, and not just building relationships, but also maintaining them as well. Thanks for listening to this episode, and I hope that you've enjoyed it and have taken away some useful points from it. I believe that tax and soft skills are essential in order for you to be a good tax advisor, and after this episode, I hope that you do agree. Remember that you can register your interest to get further details about the tax courses that I'm currently designing to help tax professionals early in their careers to quickly develop these skills by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/training for tax professionals. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, then you can send an email to me at jack@thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com. There's no need to remember these links and my email address. The only one that you need to remember really is the one to the show notes for this episode, because that contains all the links mentioned and my email address. So if you head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP49, then you'll be able to get all of these links and my email address. But that's it for this episode. I hope you liked the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career. Until next time.